الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الكريم وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن استنى بسنة إلى يوم الدين. All praise is due to Allah, and may Allah's peace and blessings be on the last Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and on all those who follow the path of righteousness until the last day. Basically, we have finished our section on Usul al-Aqidah. This is an introduction really to the Usul of Aqidah, and we are now going on into Usul al-Tafsir. The first of the topics from Usul al-Tafsir, and Usul means basically foundations, coming from the Arabic term asl, which means an origin, the base, the root. It's called the asl. So usul is the plural from it, meaning foundations, foundational principles. Tafsir comes from the Arabic verb fassara, yufassiru tafsiran, which means to explain or to clarify. So when we're talking about usul al-tafsir, we're talking about the fundamental principles necessary for Quranic interpretation, the tools which enable us to interpret the Quran correctly, accurately, within human limits or limitations. Now, for us to look at the Quran itself, we may look at it from an external perspective, the structure and these kind of things, or we may look at it from an internal perspective, its contents and these types of things. We'll start from the external and look at how the Quran was compiled and collected. Is this something, basic knowledge, which every Muslim should know? We don't have a problem in dealing with the history of the Quran's collection, because it only confirms for us in the end its authenticity. Whereas religions like Christianity, Buddhism and all these others, when you go into the history of the compilation of their scriptures, what that does is it creates doubts in the minds of the followers as to its authenticity. And this is why they don't like to go there. They keep that hidden from the followers. They weave a bunch of other stories, to give the text a sense of emotional authority. Right? This is what they work from. Inspired scribes, And this is what they like to focus on, This is the emotional. But now when you get down to the nitty-gritty, the academic realities, the historical facts concerning compilation, then you know that what's in the hands of the Buddhists today is unreliable. What's in the hands of the Christians today is unreliable. What's in the hands of the Jews today is unreliable. Historical criticism by their own scholars confirm that the material that they have is of questionable authenticity. Either they tell you that the Gospels were written by unknown authors, and they will tell you that. Those who are honest, you'll find it in their writings, in the encyclopedias and all this kind of stuff. It's there. Or they will tell you that, the material in it is of questionable historical authenticity, because much of the text wasn't confirmed in their earliest manuscripts. So when you go to the what is known as the Codex Vaticanus, and you compare it to later manuscripts, in the 6th century, 10th century, you find all kinds of material that wasn't in the Codex Vaticanus or the Codex Sinaiticus. These are their earliest two compilations of the New Testament. And in those codices, you find material which isn't available in the current text that we have. And between these two codices, you find material in one which is not in the other. So that their scholars will tell you that the documents of the Gospels alone exceed 5,000. No two documents agreeing on all facts. You have a problem. Historical analysis proves the lack of authenticity. This is why they skirt around the issue. They don't deal with it. It doesn't increase them in iman. It increases them in doubt. Whereas our look at the origin of the compilation of the Quran, this increases us in iman. This is why we learn it. This is why it should be taught. Our children should know it. Know who the figures are, what happened, what took place, why. No problem with it at all. So we know Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's prophethood spanned 23 years. He received revelation at the age of 40, approximately 610 of the Christian era, and that continued until 632 at the time of his death. And we know that the Quran was revealed to him in segments, in pieces. It didn't come to him as a complete text. Furthermore, we know that initially, when that text was revealed to him, he attempted to memorize it by repeating whatever he heard from Angel Gabriel, Angel Jibreel. Then Allah instructed him, saying, لا تحرك به لسانك لتعجل به إن علينا جمعه وقرآنه فإذا قرأناه فاتبع قرآنه. Do not move your tongue hastily to learn it. Indeed, I will collect it and recite it. So when I recite it, follow its recital. Allah told the Prophet ﷺ, don't try to memorize it by repeating after Angel Gabriel. I will protect it with you. And when the Prophet ﷺ stopped doing that, whatever came to him was burnt into his memory. Whatever Allah chose for him to forget was forgotten from his memory. Now, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is known to have been what they called Ummi. This has been translated as illiterate, though when we use the term illiterate, we're talking about somebody who is ignorant. Not only does he not know how to read and write, but he likely doesn't have any kind of higher knowledge of the language and expression and means of communication, all these kind of things. Whereas when we talk about Prophet Muhammad ﷺ being Ummi, we're only talking about him being unable to read and write. That's all. But in terms of his mastery of the language, his ability to express himself and to understand what was said, then it was at its peak. He was trained from the childhood. He was sent by his mother to be with Halima as-Sa'diyah, a Bedouin woman sent outside of Mecca for him to develop his linguistic skills. This was the tradition. So he grew with that same tradition. And the Arabian culture in that era was basically an oral culture. Most of the people did not know how to read and write. So they depended on their memories. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ fell into that general category. Now, as he learned the Quran himself, he used to teach it to his companions by reciting portions of the Quran in prayer. This was a means of teaching them. Now, you and I may question, how in the world that's somebody going to teach somebody? Somebody recites Surah Al-Baqarah for you. The first time you ever heard it, it went in one ear, went out the other. Right? So how is that a mode of teaching? Well, you have to consider that in those times, because the people were an oral culture, and they used to have contests in Ta'if and other locations, Uqad, where people used to gather from all around Arabia, and they would, as poets, as people of oratory, would stand up and say long odes and poems and elaborate, beautiful statements as a means of showing their own personal greatness as well as the greatness of their tribes. They used to meet for these contests, and they so much loved poetry that the 7 most popular poems were etched in gold and hung on the Kaaba, became objects of worship. No problem. They idolized, adored beautiful poetry. And they were known. People would come from some part of Arabia, they would run off an ode of 100 lines. And after they finished doing it, others who heard it for the first time would stand up and repeat the same thing, line for line, word for word. I mean, this is something unimaginable in our times. Right? Why? Because we are from a written culture. And this is why it's important for you to understand that the experiment which is commonly done in schools, I'm sure you've all experienced this, where the teacher, your English teacher or whoever, will write a little paragraph of material and have the first person in your class on the right hand side, for example, or left hand side, read it, little paragraph, 5-6 sentences. Then he or she will tell the person behind what they heard. Then that person tells the next one, tells the next one, tells the next one, working all the way down the classroom to the last person. And the last person stands up and says what he or she heard, and then they read what the original thing was. Everybody has a big laugh. You never wondered what was the purpose of that? The purpose of that experiment is to deride oral culture. That is the single purpose of it. You cannot rely on orally transmitted information. So those societies that are known to be oral societies, where their history has been handed down orally over generations, you cannot rely on this stuff. It's probably a bunch of nonsense, hogwash. But the reality is not the case. This is not the reality. Yes, you do this in a written culture and you have that result. But in an oral culture, where from the time you are able to communicate, you are required to memorize material constantly, you have a whole different situation. When mom sends you to the store, down to the trader who is selling their whatever goods they're selling, and she tells you, you need to get me a this and a that and the other and and you go and you come back and you didn't get what she told you, you got a spanking. Next time, you listen attentively and you make sure you bring back what she asked you to get. And you are raised with that tradition. Now you have memory at a stage which we cannot imagine. So now you do that same experiment in a class of people from an oral culture, and that first story which is said to the other person will end up in the end. Maybe if one word or here is slightly changed, but the meaning exactly the same. They don't lose it because their minds have been trained. As the people of a written culture, their minds have not been changed. And this is why, for example, you'll see professors who come out of Egypt, places like this, where it is standard for you to memorize the Quran, to memorize the 1,000 lines of poetry of Alfiya, which Ibn Malik, which teaches you all the grammar rules in 1,000 lines of poetry, and you memorize, the Alfiya of Al-Iraqi, all of the rules of hadith science are all put in 1,000 lines of poetry. You have 1,000 for this and 1,000 for that. They're growing up memorizing this stuff. They go into school, of course they're studying in other areas, maybe they go into science or whatever. They come over to America, they get their PhDs, whatever, and you see the difference between the American professor. When he comes, he's going to teach, he's got all his notes there, he's flipping through his notes, and the Egyptian professor, he comes and he's just giving you the lecture. No books, no papers. It's all in his head. It's amazing. You say, wow, this guy really knows his stuff. That's the difference, because he has been trained in that tradition. This is the difference. I know it myself personally. I used to, when I studied in Medina, most of my professors were Egyptians. And professor which we had for tafsir, this man was an encyclopedia, a walking encyclopedia. He didn't bring a single piece of paper to class. And he would run down from the Quran, he would take this verse and he'd break it down and give all the explanations of Tabari and Ibn Kathir and everybody else. And we would have the books there, look and say, wow, man, this guy is just right on it, And if we ask him something in grammar, he would quote the lines from Alfiya and break it down for us, no matter what subject you came to him with, This is a whole another level of memory, right? So that experiment, which was done to ridicule oral culture, is false. It is used out of context, and it doesn't prove anything beyond the fact that in a written culture you can't rely on orally transmitted information. That's all it proves. That's all it proves, right? Anyway, so Prophet Muhammad ﷺ reciting Baqarah in Salah among his companions, they heard him recite it once or twice, and they had it. And they were reciting Baqarah in their Salah. So reciting Quran in Salah was a means of teaching his companions Quran. And this is why in Islam, when we are choosing the Imam, right? Tradition says if we got to make the Imam, we choose the Sheikh, the one with the biggest beard, the oldest. He's the one we choose to lead us in prayer. But that's not what Islam says. That's what tradition might say. Islam says it's the one who knows the most Quran. As one of the companions said, after he had stayed with the Prophet ﷺ and studied, he had memorized all of Baqarah. He came back to his tribe, and he in a group, they informed the tribe that the Prophet ﷺ said, the one who leads you in prayer should be the one who knows the most Quran. And he said, when they looked around, it turned out that I knew the most Quran. And I was only around 6 years old at the time. So I led the tribe from that point onward. That is the Sunnah. Today, if we gather together and somebody says, hey, we got a little kid here, 6 years old, let him lead the prayer. What? We got the Shaykh here, No. The one who knows, memorized the most Quran is the one who leads the Salah. And that is the correct priority. Why? Why do we give priority of him over the sheikh, the older person, etc.? Why? Because it is better that we have that kid, because the sheikh, of course, he is more pious, he's practicing the deen, and all of this other things of purity and piety is all there. The little kid, he's a naughty little kid anyway, normally, right? You get him out of the prayer, he's naughty. But he knows his Quran. We still favor him over the sheikh. Why? Because it is better to have him recite the Quran for us, so we are exposed to as much of the Quran as possible, than to have the sheikh, he's an old man, whatever, all he knows is Qul Huwallahu Ahad. So every salah is Qul Huwallahu Ahad, He may be pious, but it is not improving our exposure to the Quran, because the idea is we want to hear as much of Allah's word as possible. So we put the kid up front, even though he's naughty, he knows the most Quran, let him lead the salah. This is the correct, this is the principle behind it, right? So Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in his prayers, he used to recite, chunks from the different parts of the Quran, and the Sahaba used to memorize it. Also, everyone who accepted Islam was taught portions of the Quran which was necessary for them to establish their salah. You needed to know something of the Quran to make salah. Of course, I should mention here that if a person doesn't know any of the Quran, what do you do? What do you do? If they haven't learned Surah Al-Fatiha, what do you do? Tasbih. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, one occasion, one of the Bedouins came to him and told him, hey, I can't memorize this thing. Surah Al-Fatiha. He couldn't memorize Surah Al-Fatiha. So the Prophet ﷺ told him to say in his prayer, Subhanallah, walhamdulillah, wa la ilaha illallah, wallahu akbar. This is what we are supposed to teach people when they first come in. Subhanallah. This is something everybody knows, we say. When something happens which is amazing, we say Subhanallah. You teach, these are amongst the phrases of the Muslim. Walhamdulillah, everybody says Alhamdulillah. We say it, thanking Allah for them. Wa la ilaha illallah, we have to say that to become Muslim. Allahu Akbar, the prayers. So the person who doesn't know Al-Fatiha, what he does or she does is they recite that until they learn the Fatiha, and they recite in the rest of their prayer that until they replace the different parts by the correct phrases and du'as, etc. to say. This is the correct methodology. Not to do as I did. Nobody told me any better. When I first came into the deen, I wrote out Fatiha on a piece of paper, put it down on the mat in front of me, big letters, so I would read it from the mat. No, this is not correct. I did it. Other people did it. But this is not the correct